Welcome to Chapter 13 of Understanding Human Development. We're going to finish talking about young adulthood as we talk about personality and socio-cultural development. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the social contexts that affect the process of self-actualization. We're going to look at how cultural and personal values affect adult relationships. We're going to relate parenthood to adult development. We're going to evaluate influences on the occupational cycle, and we're going to analyze how women experience work in the United States. So let's talk about young adulthood more as we continue in the second half of this stage. Early adulthood is a time for establishing meaningful personal relationships. And it's, as you recall, Erickson talked about this is the stage for intimacy. And so creating long-lasting relationships are particularly important, romantic relationships. It's also time for career exploration as well as professional growth. And it's a transition time between adolescence and a full assumption of adult roles. So now they're adults and they're taking on these new roles, basically. And increasingly, young adults are taking longer to make the commitments that typically define this period. That's why we have emergent adulthood as well. And so as people become adults, they tend to focus on establishing intimate relationships, finding a job or a career, and becoming more comfortable with their personal identity. So finding a satisfying intimate relationship and career involves role changes, although such adjustments are usually more subtle than in earlier stages of life. So, with earlier stages of life, as children advance, they tend to go through dramatic changes in their roles. But adults, it's a lot more subtle. And so there are domains of self, and we're going to talk about that. There's three domains. There's self as an individual, the self as a family member, and the self as a worker. So these involve dynamic interactions among the self as an individual, family member, and a worker. And we all typically have these different parts of ourselves. We have our workplace and we have the family context that we belong to. And then all of these take place in a larger or broader context of community and culture. So let's talk about the personal self first. There are different humanistic approaches that help us to understand motivations for an individual's needs. Humanistic approach includes Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs as well as Carl Rogers. And so Maslow's hierarchy of needs talks about how the ultimate goal of life is self-actualization. And on the lower needs in the hierarchy must be met in order to attain the higher needs. And so often life circumstances often require people to focus on their more immediate needs that are lower in the hierarchy of needs. So let's take a look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so, if you're wanting to learn this, I would recommend that you really try to remember the different stages or different, the different steps of the pyramid. And so the bottom level is the physiological domain, and these include needs that are basic for human survival. We can't live without them. So we need to breathe, we need to eat, we need water, we need to procreate, or we wouldn't survive as a human species. So there's sex, there's sleep, homeostasis, and excretion. All these are bodily functions. And our brain is involved in regulating these. And then on the next level up, higher level, is safety. We all have a need for security of body, security of employment, of resources, family, of health, and of properties. We need to feel safe in our homes and in our bodies. Then above that is a need for longing or belonging. We have needs for friendship, family intimacy, and sexual intimacy. And then above that, we have a need for esteem. And that includes self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect by and of others. And at the top is the need for self-actualization. This includes, basically, we want to feel good about ourselves. We want to feel that we have a sense of morality, creativity, spontaneity. We are growing as we solve problems and challenges because it gives us a sense of fulfillment, essentially. So according to Abraham Maslow, the ultimate goal of self-development is self-actualization, which is realizing one's full development by using one's talents and abilities. Now, let's talk about Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers noted that personal development is often thwarted when we have conditions of worth that are placed on an individual. Conditions of worth are conditions that others impose upon us if we are worthwhile as human beings, and thus often involve the withdrawal of affection and approval unless our behavior conforms to another's expectations. Unfortunately, we should all be able to feel loved and accepted regardless of whether we meet other people's expectations. We're not put on this planet to, please other people necessarily. And we're all intrinsically worth something. And so, like Maslow, Rogers also believed that individuals are motivated toward self-fulfillment and self-actualization. So, according to Rogers, positive development is encouraged when people are treated with warmth and acceptance. Rogers called this unconditional positive regard. So in contrast to conditions of worth, he believed in unconditional positive regard, which is warmly accepting another person as a worthwhile human being without reservations or conditions of worth. Basically, accepting people. And it's unconditional acceptance. We accept people where they're at. And honestly, I really resonate with that. Carl Rogers' approach to therapy, person-centered approach, has really influenced my own personal approach to therapy. I just call it treasure therapy, which is really just about appreciating and valuing all people. That's really the same thing as unconditional positive regard. We accept all people as being worthwhile human beings with intrinsic dignity. So that's an a priori assumption that is at the basis of this approach. So there is a modern perspective on the self. This is, and I'm sorry if I do not know how to pronounce this name, but it's Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Again, I am assuming that the first name is related to the end of the last name because it's spelled the same. So anyway, I'm just wondering about that, but I don't really know. I just know that this person proposed a concept called flow, which actually is a very popular concept in positive psychology. And so flow motivates us to accomplish our best. And it's similar to self-actualization, this idea of self-actualization or peak performances. This perspective and other modern perspectives, like on peak performance, perspectives on the self, often focus on our identity, which includes both one's traits as well as one's role. Now, all of these peak states are oftentimes rare, whether it's self-actualization, peak experiences, or flow. They're rarely attained, they're often challenged, and yet they are a positive aspect of our human experience. So, and if they are related to our identity, then our identity is fluid. Anyway, I want to keep moving on, but I just want to pay special attention on how flow is related to self-actualization. So another domain of our adult selves is our self as a family member. Achieving independence from our parents is an important aspect of identity development in early adulthood. And yet, independence is very complex. There's different types of independence. There is emotional independence, attitudinal independence, functional independence, and conflictual separation from one's parents. Now, supportive parental relationships in life foster that smooth transition into independence. As a therapist, I oftentimes tell people that basically having secure attachments is the foundation of independence. If we're not able to have secure relationships, then we tend to be clingy, or we either tend to be codependent or counterdependent rather than interdependent. And so that's why Erik Erikson, if you recall, he talks about autonomy as one of his early stages in childhood, but before that is a building of trust. A child has to have trust before they can establish autonomy. And same thing throughout lives, secure parental relationships helps young people develop their sense of independence. So family roles are also often the most important component in young adults' identities, and that's because of that. As I talk to young people, I'm reminded how their relationship with their parents oftentimes affects their relationships with other people. And independence in adulthood is a gradual but important part of development in early adulthood. Let's look at, again, those different aspects of independence. As I mentioned, there's emotional independence. And this is when young adults become less dependent on parents for their social and psychological support. A lot of times young people rely on their parents to provide them a sense of security, which is really important, in life. But at some point, we have to realize that we can't always depend on our parents. Their parents are always going to be there. They're going to eventually pass away, and hopefully not too soon. But at some point, we have to stop relying on them for our financial security and that sort of thing. So we have to really learn to rely. We have to develop that sense of security for ourselves and become more independent, basically, emotionally. And we may have to rely on other supports, like our spirituality or whatever, to give us a sense of security in this life. Young adults also develop attitudes, values, and beliefs that are independent from and possibly even different from those held by their parents. And this is actually a very important, critical phase in young people developing their own sense of identity. A lot of times young people will reject their parents' religions or their political affiliations. And that's not to say that they'll never come back, but it's important for them to go through that transition period of time where they might leave the church and they might leave their family's identity, but oftentimes so that they can claim it for themselves. And then they may come back eventually, but they'll come back on it on their own terms, and it may look differently, but they will have inculcated the values of their parents, but not because their parents told them to, but because they want to. And that's important. A lot of times parents are afraid of their children rejecting their values, but the reality is that they're just going through a transition in which they will oftentimes adopt similar values as their parents, but they must do it on their own terms. Otherwise, they wouldn't be independent. Young adults also become financially independent, and they can take care of their own day-to-day problems. So this is functional independence. This is where they start to pay for their own bills. They start to do their own laundry. They can drive themselves. They can get up and go to work on their own. And that's a distinctive feature of young adulthood, and very somewhat different from emergent adults, because emergent adults are very much still dependent on their parents. And then there's conflictual types of independence. Young adults oftentimes go through separation from, they oftentimes try to separate from their parents, but it's oftentimes accomplished with feelings of guilt or betrayal. So obviously they want to be able to separate and accomplish that without feeling guilty or be like they're betraying their parents. But unfortunately, oftentimes parents will give them the guilt trip. You might have seen in movies, a lot of movies about the guilt trip. And that's a common theme among young adults, because parents feel like it's a betrayal when young adults are doing something different. And but this is kind of a normal part of the developmental process, coming back to like I said, with attitudinal independence. And, it's important for parents not to rely on guilt trips, to coerce their children. Otherwise, it sets up conflict, creates conflict. There's important, and that's when families really have to learn about boundaries. Then we also have the self as worker, another domain of adult life. There's two types of motivations that people have toward work. We have extrinsic motivations and intrinsic motivations. Extrinsic motivations are things that excite us about the kind of work, or actually, no, take that back. These are the kinds of things that reward us for doing work that we might not otherwise do. Intrinsic motivations are things that excite us and make us want to do what we do. And so intrinsic motivations include when jobs involve repetitive, mundane, and boring tasks. And people usually focus on these intrinsic factors of their jobs, such as salary, status, comfort, or convenience of the work environment. And people will find their joy and satisfaction oftentimes outside of work, which is very normal. When I ask young people about what they want to do in life, almost always they say they want to make a lot of money. But they don't really think about the kinds of work that will actually make them happy. Oftentimes money can be a source of, giving people a sense of that they're accomplishing goals in life. But money doesn't always buy happiness. They're not necessarily the same thing. You can get a lot of money on your job, but not actually be happy with it. I can attest to that because I used to be in the computer industry, and I made a lot of money. I made a lot more money than I do in education, but I wasn't necessarily happy. It wasn't really something I found fulfilling. But I did shift as a young adult. During my young adult years, I realized that I need to find something that's more rewarding that I enjoy. And I kind of got bored with computers because once you learn a skill, you have to try and learn something new. Otherwise, it kind of gets monotonous. So, I wanted something that provides me a challenge and gives me opportunities for growth and feeling fulfilled. And so those are the intrinsic motivations we have toward work. So another thing that we do as adults, going back to the family domain, is that we form close relationships, particularly romantic long-term relationships and commitments. So young adults are trying to find a partner, make long-term commitments, and close relationships are critically important to the development in young adulthood. I remember when I was talking to young people about, what their needs are, and they're not really concerned about, especially in their 20s, they're not particularly concerned about their health as much. They do more when they get into the 30s. But early young adults are really more concerned about their romantic relationships. And that is really going to be the motivating force for whether they take care of their health or not. Because those that don't feel like anybody cares about them are going to be less likely to care for their health. And friendships, and they are interested in developing deep quality friendships too. Friendships are characterized by positive emotional attachment. They help fulfill needs, and they provide a sense of interdependence, not necessarily avoidance or clinginess, but that they are able to have, they're able to come together and come apart, and that's what interdependence is, the balance of closeness and separation. So as I said, romantic relationships are particularly important for young adults. Erik Erikson proposed that establishment of meaningful, intimate relationships is the primary developmental task of young adulthood. So how do people choose their mates? Why do some people decide to marry while others decide to cohabit? And why do some people choose to remain single? That's what we're going to look at next. So let's talk about some theories related to why or how people choose romantic relationships. But I just want to mention, first of all, that today there is greater flexibility and acceptance of the various ways in which intimate relationships can exist, although most adults continue to embrace traditional family choices of marriage and parenthood. So the first theory is the stimulus value role theory. According to this theory, we choose our romantic partners so that we can get the best deal. This is also related to structural or social exchange. but this is a little more specific, related to mate selection or partnering. So in this, as I said, it's about getting the best deal. So couple formation takes place during 3 stages. First of all, they have a stimulus stage. This is when they're interested in each other. They make initial first judgments, first impressions about whether this person is going to be interesting or not. So once somebody catches their eye, that's basically stimulating, right? So it's the stimulus stage. You might think about as someone has to have a little chemistry for them to catch your attention. Or maybe it's just, something else, but basically they have to catch your attention. Then you go through a stage of value comparison, meaning, is this person compatible? And do you have similarities? So you might wonder, do you guys have similar interests, attitudes, beliefs? Are your interests, attitudes, beliefs, and needs compatible with each other? I remember one person who I was interested in. She caught my eye, and yet we realized that we had nothing in common, or we did not have similar directions in life. I wanted to go into helping people through mental health and spirituality, and she wanted to go into physical therapy, and that kind of healthcare practice. And even though we're both into health in a sense, we just had different, it just was not the same. We had nothing we could talk about really. So those are things that are important. People want to also know that they have similar values, whether it's political or spiritual. And are their needs similar? Are you going to have compatible needs too? Like, for example, maybe, both people are extremely outgoing, or both people are extremely introverted. That wouldn't be compatible either, because, they're not really, they may not balance each other out, or maybe they would always be in conflict and that sort of thing. So you have to decide whether this relationship is compatible. And the last one is the role stage. And this is determining whether the couple can function in compatible roles in a marriage or long-term commitment. And so a lot of people might think, yeah, this person's really interesting, but can you imagine being with that person for the next 50 plus years, for the rest of your life? That's also very different, So just because you're able to answer the questions about, your preferences, doesn't mean you still want to be with that person for the rest of your life. And so that's where the role stage comes in. And these are the 3 main types of judgments or evaluations that must occur as people choose their romantic partners. So, as I said, relationships begin with the initial stimulus stage, which involves initial judgments about attraction. Then they move through the value comparison stage, which involves compatibility. And finally, they end at a role stage, which involves making long-term commitments to each other. There's also Sternberg's triangular theory of love, and this provides a developmental perspective, or we're going to look at it from a developmental perspective. And Sternberg believed that Robert Sternberg defined love as having 3 components in his triangular theory of love. Many forms of love are possible, reflecting different balance of these 3 components. And those are intimacy, passion, and decision or commitment. So intimacy is the feeling of closeness that occurs in loving relationships. And it's so people feel happiest when their partner is around. Intimacy literally means, and a lot of times people think intimacy means sex, but intimacy really means knowledge. You might think of like in the Bible where it says Adam knew Eve in the biblical sense. In that sense, intimacy means a complete knowing, and so sex might be the pinnacle of it, but in knowing a person completely really means a lot more than that. And so there's a friendship that's required in order to get to know people. You have to be able to have conversations and really understand each other. Then there's passion. This refers to physical attraction, arousal, and sexual behavior in a relationship. You can have passion that can exist without intimacy, and vice versa. You can have intimacy without passion. Passion is this gut feeling, that draws us toward the other person. There's a physical arousal, essentially. Makes our heart race when we're near that person. And that's passion. And then there's decision or commitment. This involves a realization of being in love and the establishment of a commitment to maintain it. A lot of people think, so a lot of people don't realize that commitment is very important. And oftentimes this is the hardest part for people. It's the scariest part, because it may be easy to jump into intimacy or passion, but they may be scared to make that commitment to somebody. On the other hand, some people are ready to make a commitment so much that they're ready to jump into any relationship with somebody, but they don't really have the intimacy or the passion for the person. So you really need all three of these. So let's look at the various shades of love depending on the balances of these. So you might have a liking for somebody, and this is where you have intimacy, but there's no passion or decision. You're basically just like roommates. You can have infatuation. It's where you have a passion for somebody, but you don't really know the person. You just met them, and there's no commitment. So that would be like a one-night stand. This would be infatuation. Then there's empty love, where you have no intimacy, no passion, and no commitment. And there's really nothing there. I would think there's also, sometimes people have what is an institutional kind of commitment. I don't think I see that on here, but where it's just a commitment, but it's a commitment to an institution of marriage, but they don't have intimacy or passion. They just have some kind of commitment. It's kind of a dead love, I guess you could say. And then there's a romantic love. This is where people have intimacy and passion, but there's not a decision or commitment yet. They're just falling in love. And some people just like falling in love, but that's it. Then there's companionate love. This is a little more than liking. They have a commitment to each other, and they're companions. They have intimacy and they have commitment, but the passion's kind of gone. They don't have that chemistry or spark anymore. They're just kind of like roommates, dedicated roommates. But that's about it. Then you have fatuous love. This is where it's fast and quick, and they just kind of like, they moved in, they have passion, and they have a decision, but they still don't know each other. There's a lot of people like that. They love each other. They're in a relationship that is with somebody, but they don't really know the other person. So it's, they're like strangers living together. They might even have passion for each other, but they don't really know each other. But the best form is consummate love. Consummate love is the kind of love that has intimacy, passion, and commitment. Now, I ask people, oftentimes I ask my students, if you had to choose which one was the most important of these, which would it be? And I would challenge people to think about that. Which is the most important for you? Intimacy, passion, or commitment? All of them, of course, are important, so it's kind of a trick question. But if you had to choose, which one would it be? It challenges people to think, can you do without any of them? No, you really can't. All of them are really important. Now, let's talk about arranged marriages. Arranged marriages are normal in many parts of the world. In the U.S., we're very accustomed to romantic relationships, or relationships that are built on romance. But that's not necessarily the case for everywhere. Dating and marriage customs vary widely around the world, but adults in most Western cultures tend to choose their own romantic partners. So we get to choose romantic partners. But in many other cultures, arranged marriages are common, and that means they're arranged by their parents. So consequently, the concept of being in love is less important in these settings. Marriages are crafted with religious, cultural, or financial goals in mind. They might want people to marry someone of the same religion or same class, or they may be marrying with financial or economic expectations. Now, it's important to understand that arranged marriages are not necessarily forced marriages. They're not. I mean, hopefully there may be some, but that's generally not the case. Young people who are living in these cultures expect to have their marriages arranged by their parents, and it's kind of just part of what they do. Now, if they really didn't want to be married to that person, then obviously that they might raise an objection, and the parents might consider it. But generally, though, young adults raised in cultures where arranged marriage is normal, and love is for them, love is not a critically important component of marriage. Now, it's interesting, though, with time, though, many people who are in arranged marriages do say that they eventually learn to love their partners with time. And it's just different. They just, we choose our partners, and so then we fall in love from the get-go. Other people are choosing their partners for them, and they will fall in love probably, hopefully, with time. Now, hopefully, but again, love is generally not as critically important. Now, Western concepts of marriage are spreading around the world, and so that arranged marriages have historically been the predominant method throughout history, but the ideals of romantic marriages are being spread more. So people are gaining more and more freedoms. It's becoming less. There's a lot more flexibility about it now than there used to be. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that. So more than 90% of U.S. men and women will marry at some point, although marriage rates in the United States have been declining in recent years. Now, unfortunately, I would say the dating process can be very challenging, and that's why many people wish they had arranged marriages, to be honest, because at least they don't have to deal with the whole dating process. It can be really stressful for some people. Monogamous marriage still remains the most popular and frequent lifestyle of choice. So that is the most popular. And like I said, 90% of people will eventually marry. So that's good news for those people who are single and wondering if they'll ever get married. There is hope. Just about everybody gets married at some point. So this is a percentage of the U.S. population that has not married by sex and age group. And you can see that, over time, as people get older, that percentage drops. Now, if you're older, past 40s, and you're still not married, or you've never been married, well, you might feel a bit lonely and out of place. So, you do want to try and get married while you're younger, or you might feel a little out of place. The major reason that it's difficult to estimate the marriage trends on a population-wide basis is that marriage patterns and the rates are changing rather dramatically in the United States, making it difficult to project into the future. One feature of the change is that the percentage of U.S. adult population that is married is falling. So, compared to 1960, when about 65% of the population over the age of 15 was married, today this rate is much lower, about 50%. So with marriage rates declining among all U.S. major racial and ethnic groups. So it is, it has been declining in marriage, at least, if we look at the overall population. So while I said 90% will become married at some point, at any given time, the overall percentage of people who are married is a lot lower than it used to be. So something to be aware of. The percentage of all persons in the United States who were ever married, like I said, has been declining. And so the reasons for the decline in the marriage rate are many and range from the increase in cohabitation to the longer life expectancy. So many people are just living out longer, and they survive past their spouses, and so they become widows. And the divorce rate and the increase in age at first marriage also factors. So a lot of people are also postponing their marriages as well. So that's another reason. So let's look at the reasons for the decline in the marriage rate in the United States. So as I said, people are choosing to marry later in life, and there's change in demographics. There's cohabiting. Many people are living together without getting married, and there's also same-sex marriages, and so that's has become legal. And yet, statistics on that, as well as cohabitation, are really not there. So we don't have a lot of information on it. Now, marriage, why do people get married though? Well, people get married because it's expected to provide emotional sustenance, sexual gratification or pleasure, as well as financial security. And this is especially important for raising children. People, when they have children, they want to make sure that their children are going to be provided for. And marriage provides a good safety net for their children, and just in case, something goes wrong. Now, if they divorce, married couples have greater legal protections. Now, there's culture. Culture does play a role in how marriage is defined. So marriage is often defined by cultural aspects, such as the dowry or multiple wives or things like that. So just take, for example, in Arab culture, the transition to married life is orchestrated by older relatives. Marriage is oftentimes arranged. Male elders may conduct bride price negotiations, and even cousin marriages may be okay. In African culture, there are dowries, and again, that's payment that's given to the other partner's family. Polygamy is very common in many regions, and I wondered why people do this when I went to the Middle East, and somebody pointed out to me that while we may look down on polygamy, which is multiple wives, they may look down on serial monogamy, which is what we do in the United States. People will divorce and they'll have like multiple exes. The problem is that in some cultures, when someone divorces, it leaves the women in poverty, and because they are so financially and economically dependent on their partners. So if you divorce, that wife is going to be, really struggling. So polygamy is one way of at least providing for the spouse. So rather than divorcing, you may just take on another wife. In Northern Africa, marriage arrangements are similar to those in Arab cultures. So that's just an interesting tidbit. So there are other cultural dimensions that affect marriage. For some, sexual intimacy is reserved for marriage, particularly for those who are of religious persuasion. For some, they frown on mixed marriages of any kind. And mixed marriages may include interreligious, or interracial. So many social groups, institutions, as well as parents still frown on mixed marriages of any kind, preferring that individuals marry others of the same ethnic, racial, religious, or even socioeconomic group. Religious interracial relationships are still very, I would say, even though it's politically correct to say it's accepted, if you look at the percentages, it's still very much the minority. Most people tend to marry within their same race, as well as the same religion and same class. Now, although today in the United States, same-sex marriage is a protected right, there's still some controversy about this practice among people groups. So in 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court ruling legalized same-sex marriage. So there's still some controversy, particularly around the issue of adoption. There's some people don't want same-sex couples to adopt their children. The American Academy of Pediatrics supports allowing gay male and lesbian partners to adopt their partner's children. They believe, the research says, that the children of same-sex parents show no difference in outcomes from children raised by heterosexual parents. So all the views of marriage for same-sex couples are shifting rapidly. Some people living in the United States still view marriage as an institution to be entered into only by a man and a woman. And they feel that, and they especially believe that children have a right to both a mother and a father. And so, of course, the argument against that is, well, having any parent is better than no parent or being stuck in the foster care system. And so that's why people believe they should allow same-sex couples to adopt. Because of the pressure to conform and the desire to raise children in traditional family, some will enter into what's called mixed orientation marriages. And that means they may be privately gay or lesbian, but they're married to someone of the opposite sex so that they can have a child and conform to society's expectations. And if it works for them, it works for them. What may be challenging or is problematic is if the other person is not aware of the mixed orientation going on. And because what happens is that sometimes after the children grow up, then the person who's gay or lesbian may exit the relationship because they got what they need. And so that can be kind of sad because now you see the breakup of the family. The more U.S. couples are cohabiting, with rates increasing more than tenfold since 1970, or some people believe it's more than 15-fold from 1970 to 2010. Cohabitation is present in all adult age groups, and there's some similarities between cohabiting and married couples. Cohabiting, like I said, is living together without being married. While most cohabiting couples plan to marry, here's the problem. Only a third actually do. So cohabiting is actually problematic. And this is not about moralizing. Actually, cohabitation, simply the research shows that there's actually a lot of problems associated with cohabiting. And I can share with you a lot of research on that. But just to summarize, cohabiting couples are, cohabiting is not linked to better or happier marriages. And in fact, it may be linked to less positive relationship outcomes. Affairs are more likely, and it's like I said, it seldom leads to positive outcomes than marriage does without prior cohabitation. In fact, the chances of divorce or breaking up, even before, the chances of breaking up prior to the wedding increases like exponentially if one lives together, and the chances of divorce after the wedding also is elevated if people live together prior to the wedding. So the research is against cohabitation, and that's not just moralizing about it. There's just research does not support it. There's actually a lot of problems about it, and especially I would say my understanding of the research is really about how power is divided. What happens is that when people live together, they tend to take each other for granted. And outside that commitment, what happens is that it tends to reinforce power imbalances. And I really believe, basically just looking at the research, that marriage actually protects people and encourages, and it's not always, and let me qualify that. Marriage may generally protect people. That's not a bulletproof protection either. Obviously, you can still have affairs after you get married. People still end up cheating and giving each other STDs and all kinds of things. So let's be clear about that. Marriage is not the perfect protection that people think it is either. But it is a legal protection in a sense. So in that sense, it helps. And that's one, and that maybe it also encourages accountability as well. And that's why, when people, get married, they stay together versus those who live together. They're much more vulnerable to power imbalances and struggles that may arise. Cohabitation patterns of same-sex couples usually more closely resemble those of married rather than cohabiting heterosexual couples. And that may be because, like I said, there are power imbalances that arise during cohabiting couples. And same-sex couples may be less prone to gender power differences. That's not to say, though, that they don't have power imbalances. They're just not the same as the traditional heterosexual. Imbalances that occurred in same-sex couples may be due to differences in age, differences in socioeconomic status or finances, that sort of thing. Not necessarily due to gender because they're the same sex. Another issue could be if they have children, though. If one person is a biological parent and the other one isn't, that could also create power differences as well. Okay, so the percentage of adults who remain single have fluctuated throughout history, often in response to historical events. This has been increasing in popularity among young adults since the 1970s, although this trend also reflects the fact that U.S. adults are also choosing to marry at somewhat later ages than in previous decades. For example, I remember when my grandparents got married, they were all in their, basically, they were teenagers, like 16 and 19. And many countries around the world, people oftentimes do get married at young ages, well before they're 20. And in some countries or cultures, if you're 20 and you're not married yet, you're like an old maid, But in the United States, of course, it's not uncommon for people to marry at much later ages than in previous generations. And that's for many reasons. Now, the periods of time with the highest rates of individuals remaining single were the Great Depression and World War II. So there's a lot of social factors, social environmental things that are going on at those times that may have prevented people from really being able to get married. So staying single is often a response to those kinds of social transitions. So let's talk about how, whether people live together or live alone. We have many living options for today's young adults. People can live with their parents. They can, they may be college students that may live in campus housing. That's very common. When they go off to campus, they may live with their romantic partners. That's cohabiting. Or they may live with non-romantic friends. They may live with a stranger to save money. And less than 10% of young adults live alone. This is not as common. The most common issue is that the finances encourage young people to want to share, because otherwise living on their own could be more expensive. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is a family life cycle. And the family life cycle refers to the stage of the family in general. Parenthood is significant in the typical family life cycle, and its challenges and demands comprise a major developmental phase. Let's look at some examples of major events in the adult life cycle. This is all typically related to the family life cycle as well. So first of all, we separate from our parents. We move out from our family of origin. Then we get married or form a significant romantic relationship. Then we typically, and these are all what we call nomothetic or normative life events. That means they're normal. And so we have a birth of a child. That means you become a parent. Then you have the enrollment of that young child, the youngest child in school. So then the parents are now free, that they can go back to work. They have some time away from their kids when their kids go to school. Then there's the departure of the last child from the family as they move out. And so that creates an empty nest now. And so, now couples have to reorient themselves to being just by themselves again. And so that sometimes that can also have its own transition problems as well. And then lastly, they will retire from their work. And sometimes that may actually, the departure of the last child from the family versus retirement may be quite close together. And then the last phase is when one partner dies. So this is a typical life cycle. And so one of the most important ones is in the beginning, especially related to young adulthood, is that transition to parenthood. Moving out, having a family, and then, getting married and having kids. And parenthood involves new roles and responsibilities and calls for numerous adjustments. The transition to parenthood generally is smoother when social support is available. Marital happiness is high, meaning that they have support from their partner because that helps them to feel happy. If they're doing it on their own, it's going to be a real struggle. And when the parents of the child have a high sense of self-esteem, meaning they can feel confident and they have a solid foundation. Otherwise, they're going to fall apart. And their baby's not too difficult. And having a challenging baby or kid can make being a parent really, a real struggle. Now, being a parent or becoming a parent involves a change in one's identity, and sometimes it's really, it's really new for people as they go from being a non-parent to parent. They have to learn how to see themselves differently, and they take on this new role. Now, women historically are more likely than men to adjust their lifestyles to prioritize parenting and family roles, whereas men are more likely to continue to work. In the United States, like I said, women are more likely than men to adjust their lives. Men often intensify their work habits because they feel the social pressure to be providers. There is an expectation that men are the providers, and so when they have kids, they feel even more pressure to make sure that there's enough money for everybody. One parent, usually the mother, will assume more of the child rearing role. Now, if the wife makes money, then maybe the father might stay home. So there are some stay-at-home dads, but that's still in the minority. So the transition to parenthood is often more challenging for single parents because they don't have as much support. And in general, though, role changes in our cultures are more and more rapid, and it's particularly for that family. As you go into becoming a parent, your role is going to change pretty quick. The social support is especially crucial for new mothers because fathers, they can get, it's not as problematic. There's not as expectations on fathers, whereas women are expected to be successful mothers. So if they don't have the support or if they're struggling, they may personalize it more. And so that's, mothers, especially single mothers. As children grow, their needs change, and so do the demands on their parents. So this is why it's important for parents to be able to cope with each child or the child's developmental stages. Each critical period for the child produces or reactivates a critical period for the parents because it requires parents now have to adjust and figure out how to cope. Parents that are unable to deal effectively with children at one stage may be great at dealing with them at another stage. It just depends a lot on the stage. Couples then must establish decision-making that will maintain respect for their partners. Parents have to renegotiate their own relationships as families adjust and adapt. So it requires an adaptable family system. So for example, when a child becomes an adolescent, the adolescent's going to require more autonomy and independence. And so that's going to require the parents are going to have to know how to relate to their child differently. And they're going to have to be able to move together the same way. The same thing like when the kids are naughty and they need to be disciplined, the younger kids, they need to be disciplined. That's going to require that couples are going to negotiate, and they need to negotiate and know how they're going to discipline together. Otherwise, what might happen is that the child gets in between the parents because they know one person's going to treat them differently than the other person does. So they have to be able to stay united. Let's talk about stages of parenthood. Now, at the birth of a child, parents have the task of creating an image of the kind of parents they will be. So this is called image making. They create an image of the kind of parents that they will be. That's image making. The next stage is about birth to age 2. So conception, this is prior to birth, I should say. Prior to birth, they're creating a vision of what they want to be. After birth, until about age 2, the parents become attached to the child and learn to balance their commitments to family versus their professional and work lives. So they're learning the work-life balance because they have a newborn. And they're trying to maintain this nurturing. Then between 2 and 5, they now have a toddler or a young child. And so they have to learn to this is where it's going to require a lot of discipline and authority. So parents have to evaluate their parenting styles and determine the roles and responsibilities. And so sometimes parents might have conflict because they want to parent differently. Maybe one wants to be more authoritarian authoritarian, and the other one wants to be more permissive. And so they may have some conflict about that. So they have to negotiate how they're going to parent. Then about 6 to 12, parents continue to evaluate and test their theories of parenting. That's the interpretive. And then as a child becomes a teenager, Parents must redefine their lines of authority to accommodate their child's increasing needs for freedom so that they learn to step back. And this is a stage of interdependence. And lastly, when the grown child leaves home, parents must let go and they also must face their successes and failures as parents. Because now the child is grown up and they can do whatever they want. And so the parents have to just be accepting that, the children aren't going to be perfect. And so sometimes they may feel ashamed or embarrassed if the children don't turn out the way they wanted them to. So let's talk about single parenthood. The overwhelming majority of single parents are unfortunately working mothers. Most single parent families in the United States are headed by mothers. In 2015, 26.8% of all families with children were headed by a single parent. It's more than a quarter of all families. They're more likely to experience financial strain. So single parents are especially prone to experience stress if economic pressures are involved. And single mothers are much more likely to live below the poverty line as are single fathers. The economic challenges are even more likely among black families headed by single mothers, especially when those mothers have limited education. Black and Hispanic families who live in poverty are more likely to have extended families who provide some support. 16% of single father families live in poverty, and 31% of single mother families live in poverty. So that's why I said single mothers are much more likely to be in poverty than single fathers. So let's talk about single mothers. So the trend of single mother families is a result of rising divorce rates, an increase in the number of marital separations without divorce, and an increase in the number of unmarried mothers, especially among black women. And what do you think is responsible for so that's something to think about. What did you think? Was it, divorce, or, there is a rise in divorce rates accompanied by mothers winning custody. It's historically the case that mothers usually got custody, although increasingly courts are recognizing that fathers also need to play a role and that they have an equal right to have custody as well, although that wasn't always the case. There is an increase in birth to unmarried mothers. So, they start off that way. They didn't have a partner, and sometimes their partners left them as soon as they got pregnant, unfortunately. Single parents sometimes experience destructive levels of stress, and single mothers consistently earn less than single fathers. So they have a lot of stress, and they need a lot of support. So there's the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. This was enacted in 1996, and this is the first major welfare reform in 60 years. The intent was to reverse welfare and poverty cycle. However, it created some problems for single parents, mostly regarding childcare. Many single mothers cannot support their children adequately when they work. So, they want them to have jobs, but if you're a single parent, it's hard to be there for your children. So the number of families living below the poverty line has increased since the law's passage. It actually did not help like it's supposed to. And so the goal of this program was to help mothers on welfare become self-sufficient workers. Early indications showed that the program was quite successful, especially for mothers with some work skills and experiences. However, limited and affordable daycare remains a challenge for many mothers, and for many, the requirement that those receiving benefits hold a job means that the opportunities for education beyond high school are more difficult to pursue. And then some people I know I've met some people who will have met a partner, but if they got married, it would actually increase their family income, and they might disqualify them for welfare. So that's kind of like some of the negative side effects as well. Single fathers also face many of the same challenges as single mothers, although they are usually better off financially. One in every 6 children is living with a custodial parent. Single fathers are generally, like I said, financially better off than single mothers, but they still experience the same levels of emotional stress. So it's important to understand, especially for single dads, because they may not have the same, they're not socialized to think of themselves as nurturing and caregivers, although it's expected of them. And if they don't do well, then they may feel ashamed that they're not adequate or that they're not able to do what they need to do. Although many single dads are very resilient, and I know because I'm not a single dad, but I'm on a dad support group, and I see many single dads who are operating very successfully. So they're out there, but there's still a lot of work because they don't have support from a mother who could help them out either. So any single parent, is really hard. Okay, so the occupational cycle refers to the sequence of periods or stages in a worker's life, from occupational exploration and choice, through education and training, to novice status, and to promotion and more experienced periods. So work influences people's attitudes and lifestyles, and it can determine the life one leads. If you're in a bad job, you're not going to feel happy with your life. In your good job, you're going to feel happy with life. It really influences the direction of our lives. Our work may influence our friends, our opinions, prejudices, and our political affiliations. And also, I'd say that many people meet their spouses through their occupation as well. So it really has a big influence in our lives. As we said earlier, there's 3 roles. We have our own self, our personal self, then we have our family self, and then our occupational self. This is the other aspect we're talking about. So every person's occupational cycle is unique, and it's filled with events and decisions. Haverhurst's classical model of occupational change or occupational choice suggests that individuals begin to think about about their work early in life, perhaps even in childhood. Little children are starting to think about what they want to do as they get older. They can be a firefighter, or doctor or whatever. They're already imagining. So here's the stages of occupational life. As children identify with their working fathers and mothers, and the idea of working enters their self-concept. Then they learn to organize their time and efforts to give work priority and when necessary. And this is related to, Erickson talks about the stage of industry. And then in teenage years and early adolescence, they develop their sense of identity. And so, we choose an occupation, and that becomes a part of our identity. Then middle-aged adults, they are becoming productive, and adults perfect their skills for their chosen job and move ahead in their career. And at their highest point of their career, they may begin to attend to more civic responsibilities, and they want to be productive in giving back to society. And lastly, they retire, and retired workers look back on their careers, hopefully with some satisfaction. So today, most people have several different jobs and many career changes in their midlife. So many people go through changes. And why? Oftentimes it's because, the jobs today are becoming increasingly technical. And so it requires that people maintain their skills or learn new skills. And before entering the workforce, people acquire formal skills such as education or training, and informal skills such as attitudes and expectations about work. So the soft skills, the experience that people get. The entry phase of the occupational cycle, when young adults start working, may involve a reality shock as people learn that their jobs may be different than they expected. For example, I'm in marriage and family therapy, and a lot of people go into my field thinking that, it's going to be like a romantic comedy, sitting there helping couples fall in love. But then they discover that couples therapy is actually really different than what they imagined, because it's oftentimes more like mediating a talk show host. Being a talk show host, mediating between high conflict couples. And so it feels sometimes more like a referee. And so that's the reality shock that people experience. And then, we have mentors. Mentors often help young people or young workers acquire appropriate job skills and attitudes. So this is a positive role in the development of young workers. They have a positive role. And women sometimes have more difficulty in finding an appropriate mentor than do men, as do members of underrepresented groups as well. For most mid-career adults, work becomes routine and mentors are often left behind. If one's career does not advance as fast or as far as they expect, sometimes the person will change their careers or look for satisfaction in non-career areas of life. For example, I can relate to that because, when I was younger, I didn't feel too satisfied with my job anymore because I felt like it was no longer challenging. So, at first I tried to find happiness in my non-career areas, like, in my church or, family, extended family. But then when I realized that, I just wasn't happy in my job, then I decided to change careers. And some people will change their careers in young adulthood. Some people will change it halfway through middle age. And so I know some people will change their careers right before they retire. It's possible anytime, especially in those cultures where people are a lot more flexible about the trajectory of, what we can do at our ages. Career counseling can be helpful, though, for people who are still thinking about what career they want to go into. The field of career counseling has emerged to help people determine which careers are best suited to their talents and interests. And this field attempts to match the talents and interests of individuals to the characteristics of a job. So that is, one of the things they may do is categorize their careers, and then there's John Holland has some theories about careers as well, which we're going to look at next. So Holland's theory of careers involves categorizing both personality types and job requirements and finding an ideal match. There's different types of personality types that people have. They may be realistic, they may be investigative, they may be artistic, social, enterprising, or conventional. And Holland believed that there's different types of careers that each personality type would go into or be best fits for. I've also seen this with the Myers-Briggs personality type, or MBTI, and there's different types of personalities or different types of careers that are associated with the personality types. So sometimes people select careers or jobs because of family expectations or economic necessity. In the United States, women are overrepresented in low-status, low-paying jobs and underrepresented in more highly paid positions and professions. There are two explanations that are possible. One is that women choose less demanding work due to family considerations, and women may also be the victims of discrimination as well. So, for example, women represent nearly all dental assistants and a very small percentage of carpenters. Further, though, the majority of dental assistants are white, and the majority of carpenters are Hispanic. Now, so it's intersection of gender and ethnicity too. So you have to, be aware of. That may be because it's not just gender, but also racial groups have different career choices available to them due to discrimination, as well as social class as well. Some groups are more open to lower paying jobs than other groups, or they may be more vulnerable to discrimination as well. So let's talk about work and gender specifically. Most women try to combine work and family roles, oftentimes taking on a more flexible approach to their career. So women are more likely than men to assume the primary family responsibilities. And the family cycle development is closely tied to how women approach their vocational goals. Let's look more specifically at changes in women's work patterns. Women have always, it's interesting, a lot of people don't realize this, but that women have always worked outside the home. It was not until the late 19th century, or the 1800s, that when men came to be viewed as the family provider. During the World War II, and so oftentimes men and women would work together and would work alongside each other in the fields, on the farms, or even in the factories. It was during World War II when women entered the workforce in record numbers, mainly because men were off to war, and so they needed women. And again, in the 1970s, more and more women have entered into the workforce. So, as I said, women have always been working outside the home, although the change in social expectations and historical events have had an impact on the number of women in the workforce in any given area. Ever since the 1970s, women in the U.S. workforce have been increasing. Here's a chart that shows the difference between the 1970s and 2015. You can see that there's a great difference in the educational attainment of women. One of the most developments in the employment world, in fact, is a significant increase in the percentage of women in the U.S. workforce and with their education. So as you can see, now women are much more educated than they were 40 years ago. There's also a difference in race as well and how people make money. Asian American women earn on average more than white women, whereas Black and Hispanic women make appreciably less. So race, there are differences in race and how women earn money. In two-parent families, wives' earnings make up just over 37% of total family income. That's when, with both parents working, generally the husband makes a lot more money than the wife does. Women like men, though. Why would women work if they don't make as much money as the husbands do? Well, women, like I said, women like men also find satisfaction and fulfillment in employment. Working women tend to be physically and psychologically healthier than non-working women. And women who enjoy their work gain more benefits from it, though. Women comprise about 44% of the U.S. workforce. So it's still not the equal, and that may be because of the social expectations for women to be mothers and caring for their children. But generally, there's a lot more men in the workforce, and they make more money as well. So women follow a different career trajectory than men typically. Women are making gains in many professions formerly dominated by men. So, like for example, in the computer industry or in other fields that were traditionally thought of as masculine, women are becoming increasingly present in there. Like for example, in law enforcement, there's women as well. About half of working women have low-paying, low-advancement jobs, though. And so women on average make 79 cents a day for every dollar. 79 cents today for every dollar a man earns. It's 79 cents to a dollar for men. So that's what women earn. Women, like I said, they work for many reasons, including financial necessity, as well as personal fulfillment. Working women tend to be physically and psychologically healthier than non-working women, especially if they enjoy their work, like I said. Okay, let's talk about the dynamics of dual earner couples. Why would both partners work? There's an increase of women in the labor force that has produced an increase in what we call dual earner couples, a married or unmarried couple sharing a household in which both contribute to family income through paid labor as they benefit from a higher combined family income. So the advantage is that they have higher total income, which means that they can all enjoy a higher standard of living. They have more money for daily necessities and emergencies, and fathers can play a more active role in the family. The downside, of course, is that if the mother is working, that the father may have to do more housework, and that tends to lead to role strain, role conflicts for both partners. Because the husband feels like he is not able to focus as much on his provider role, and the mother may feel like she's neglecting her motherly roles. And so oftentimes these roles between their work and family may collide. Now, although fathers usually benefit because they take a more active role, there are many stresses associated with both partners juggling family and work responsibilities, including finding acceptable childcare or daycare. It costs a lot of money, especially today, for daycare, especially around like where we live in the United States, around the East Coast. Daycare is very expensive, and so that oftentimes makes couples tempted to just let the mother stay at home instead of working. Now, dual earner couples have to figure out how they're going to share, their household chores just like every other couple. Now, with those whose both partners work, they generally share the household tasks more equally. However, most women who work still have the primary responsibility for housework and childcare. So even when they work, women still do more housework and childcare. So when the gender gap in household work narrows, it's often because women are doing less rather than men doing more. And generally, wives do 2 to 3 times more of the daily housework than husbands, which is really, I find that to be true in my own research and experience as a therapist. Women who work still assume more responsibility than men for housework and childcare, especially if they work part-time. So that's going to lead to role conflict. Women report higher levels of conflict, like I said, between work and family roles than do men. Their role conflicts stem from job demands, work hours, family and work scheduling conflicts, and family crises. Women report higher levels of conflict between work and family, and women report higher levels of guilt about how work negatively affects their family. That's because they still have the expectation that they're supposed to be the mother, even though they also want her to work because she makes more money. In the United States, under the Family and Medical Leave Act, FMLA, all employees are entitled to 12 weeks per year of unpaid family leave. This is leave required by law for the purpose of dealing with family affairs and problems, but it's generally unpaid. Many families don't have the option for extended leave, and in some families, the best option is for a parent, typically the mother, to quit working while the children are young. So, mothers are typically granted some leave after the baby is born, but fathers seldom receive paternity leave. And this is important. A lot of people don't realize that in our state, for example, Maryland, there's very little maternity leave. And so what happens is that this kind of forces mothers to stay at home instead of continuing to work because they don't have the support for childcare. And, when a baby's born, they want to be there and they can't afford to they can't, on one hand, they want to be there for their children, but on the other hand, they can't afford to leave their jobs. But oftentimes one has to take a sacrifice. So, that's one of the reasons why many women are not able to continue on. So, I support, increasing family medical leave, especially so that mothers can continue to work. This is required by law for the purpose of dealing with family affairs. Okay, there's other special problems or special challenges for low-income and dual career couples. There's still social disapproval of women who work when their children are young, and some people hold traditional values that reflect discomfort about women who work. So that's why a lot of women may feel guilty if, they're not able to fulfill that motherly role. However, there are benefits for women working, so it's important to pay attention to that. Women can gain substantial benefits from working, perhaps due to the social support that work colleagues provide and to the contributions that working makes to a woman's self-esteem. Work may serve as a buffer against family-related stresses, especially for women, and it can be a stabilizing force in young adults' lives. And lastly, women who work outside the home tend to have greater equality in say in decision-making in their marital relationships. So that's why I encourage women to work if they can. Obviously, if they have to take time off for the family, it happens. And it's very common. But it's very helpful for women to work, and it gives them a good sense of self-esteem when they know that they are contributing in other ways outside the family. Anyway, I hope that was helpful, and I hope you continue to join us as we move on to the next chapter. Thank you.